Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the panel Diverging Capitalism. I'm Edoardo Campanella. I'm a research fellow at the Mossavar Center. Delighted to see such a good turnout, even if the title of the panel is a little bit cryptic. So basically what we are going to discuss today is how the balance between the market and the state is changing and diverging across key jurisdictions, the US, China, and Europe. Simplifying a lot, we shifted from a situation where the Biden administration tried to revitalize the role of the state, rehabilitating the role of industrial policies. Now Trump is pushing towards a small but powerful government. We have China that is trying to revitalize the private sector after having suffocated it for a few years. Then we have Europe. It's unclear where it is going, what's happening, but it's something that we will try to discover. So I'm glad to be joined by three distinguished members of the HKS community. John Haigh, he is a senior lecturer of public policy here, co-director in Mossavar Center. He's usually the one introducing these seminars, but I stole his role today. Rana Mitter is a professor here and big expert of Asian affairs, prolific author. One of his most recent book is China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. And last but not least, Paul Tucker. He's a former deputy governor of Bank of England, research fellow here, prolific author as well. One of his latest book is Global Discord that will be relevant for our discussion. So I would like to start with an overview of what's happening in the free region, and maybe we can start with John and discuss what's happening in the US. So we have a techno elite that is heavily influencing the Trump administration. Do you see the risk for the US to fall into a sort of new Gilded Age?
So the answer is yes. I think there is some risk, but it's a complicated and nuanced kind of discussion. I just, out of curiosity, I get newsletters and I get just literally this morning, here are a few of the headlines. Zuckerberg lobbies Trump to avoid Meta antitrust trial. That was him visiting the White House yesterday. And then there was a competition policy conference in Washington, D.C. yesterday. And you had Lina Khan there, and I was shocked to see a picture of Lina Khan standing with Steve Bannon, and they were talking about the importance of enforcing the antitrust laws. And you can go through Senator Lee from Utah, who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee Antitrust Subcommittee, convened part of this, and big fixes for big tech. And so when I say it's nuanced, what I'm talking about is that you have a situation where you have a number of both large firms and venture capitalists and startups trying to influence the administration, right? And the administration being somewhat receptive to those discussions. If you look at the top wealthiest 7 people in the world, 6 of them are from the US, okay? And almost all of them are from big tech. Elon Musk, 342 billion. Mark Zuckerberg, 216 billion, Jeff Bezos, 215 billion, Larry Ellison, 192 billion, Warren Buffett, 154 billion, Larry Page. So you got Google, Oracle, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, SpaceX. Okay, so it's hard not to think that these people now with access to the White House aren't in some ways kind of behaving what you might call oligarchs. And what do we mean by oligarchs? I was on a call on Monday with an individual named Rahm Emanuel. He said the Democrats are fundamentally wrong because they're talking about oligarchs and the general public doesn't know what an oligarch is. But I will trust that this group is knowledgeable enough and has some perspective on an oligarch. But to me, kind of what that means is basically it's a class of individuals who, through acquisition of assets, both private, but especially state assets, amass great wealth, and maintain close links to the highest government circles, protecting those assets. And in essence, if you think about it, that kind of takes us back to an early 1900s Gilded Age to some extent in the US. And you had Rockefeller with oil, you had Carnegie with steel, you can keep going down the list, JP Morgan, you had this accumulation of wealth. But part of my earlier point was how this plays out is kind of quite complicated, because you can't think of firms and companies as kind of the tech sector, because there are a lot of different views within the tech sector. There's, as I was just kind of pointing out, you have Google, you have Meta. Meta's trying to stop the antitrust lawsuit that might require them to divest Instagram and WhatsApp. At the same time, you have kind of the startup world, which is like, don't let the big guys kill our companies. Please protect us. Just a small anecdote. I'll try to be quick, Edo, I promise. But I was out in California at Palo Alto. I was invited out of the blue to go to a guy's house named Joe Lonsdale. And he is the founder and head of 8VC, but he also was one of the founders of Palantir. And I was trying to figure out like why he invited me, because I didn't know him. And I show up, and there are like 30 people there, and it's a bunch of VCs. And it's clear he had one purpose for why he wanted to talk to me. He came over, he didn't beat around the bush. He said, "You're from the Kennedy School, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay, your job is to make sure the big guys don't come in and smash my startups, because we need space to operate." That was the whole purpose of why he invited me to come. Took him about a minute to tell me that, and then he was off to the next group of people. But that's kind of the mindset that you see these people playing out. Now, if you look at who President Trump has appointed into various roles, I just was looking, the most obvious is Elon Musk. Okay, highly benefited from government contracts of scale and scope in SpaceX, Tesla, tax breaks for EVs, kind of across the board. But the White House AI and crypto czar. Anybody know who that is? David Sachs. Okay, so who is David Sachs? David Sachs is the lead person at Kraft Ventures, which is a venture capital company. And if you look at Kraft's investments, XAI, $6 billion investment, SpaceX, $47 million, Boring Company, another Musk company, $120 million, Neuralink, $51 million. And then he has investments in a number of crypto companies, BitGo, Set Labs, Croesus. He's got about 100 million invest there and more. And then you've got his top economic and policy trade official, Jacob Hellberg, advisor to Palantir Technologies with links to Khosla Ventures. And I can keep going down the list. You've got Andrew Ferguson, who's the chair of the FTC, and he's saying FTC must prosecute tech companies who suppress free speech in violation of antitrust laws, right? So you kind of get the tone and tenor of how these people are playing out their roles, if you will, in the world. So last thing real quick. Okay, imagine, I was trying to think, like, imagine you're an oligarch, and you kind of are deeply involved in the development of AI. So what would you want from the government? Now, I may not be completely accurate on this, but when I was working through it, it was like, first, you'd like the executive and legislative branches to stay entirely out of your way as you develop your product, right? You really don't want a lot of intervention from the government. And you want to be able to go about your business. Second, you would like the US government to do what it can to prevent other countries from developing cutting-edge AI. Okay, so let's put limitations on chips and semiconductor exports to China. Let's try to block the movement of intellectual property to China. Let's stop IP theft. All of those things that will protect me. And third, you want something to be done about the remaining potential threats from domestic competition, namely from companies that could yet emerge. So there is a battle going on right now within the AI sphere about startup companies and larger companies. So if you look at something like data centers, there are only a few companies in the world that have the scale and scope and the available capital to actually build out those data centers. But they're trying to move to other parts, if you will, of the value chain or the supply chain. They want to move up into algorithms, and they want to move up into applications of AI. At the same time, you've got startup companies who are now no longer really startups, but they're building algorithms, and they're potentially going to try to figure out how to suppress the value. So Google wants to go from data centers into more on algorithms. OpenAI wants to go from algorithms and keep Google out. So you've got this very competitive dynamic occurring. Back to the point of it's a very nuanced and highly competitive environment right now. But you basically are trying to freeze the ecosystem. If you're Google, for example, there was a Google antitrust case on Google search. They were found guilty of antitrust violations. And they basically are trying to freeze the ecosystem for search, right? They don't want the change. But at the same time, you've got the AI world coming in. You've got OpenAI trying to bring AI into the search realm. So you've got this weird kind of highly competitive inflection point that we're going to go through. And these companies, to your point about Gilded Age, and I have a lot more to say, but I'll shut up for now.
Thanks a lot. You raise a number of interesting points. We will go back to these two issues related to the tech ecosystem in a moment. But I would like to focus, Rana, for a moment on this relationship between government and entrepreneurs, the private sector. It's not unusual for wealthy people here in the US to influence power. Probably what's unusual is the way they are doing it now, that is very explicit compared to the past. In China, the dynamic is completely different. It is the government, the party that tries to influence the private sector entrepreneurs. So for the last 3 years or so, the Chinese government has tried to suffocate the private sector through regulatory tightening. It is now trying to revitalize it again, probably because the global environment is not very favorable for China. How has the relationship between the party and companies in China evolved over the last 3 years, and what we can expect in the future?
Sure. Thanks, Edo. First of all, I guess if we're going back to the... if we're going back to the Gilded Age, then I guess we'll have to all read a lot of Edith Wharton novels to keep us going. I think that it's notable that the Chinese policy, which in a sense is a sort of mirror image of what John has been talking about, rather like actually the situation in the US at the moment, is in quite active and fast flux. So in other words, anything I say today might well not be the case in, well, maybe 2 weeks' time, but certainly 2 months or 2 years' time. It's likely to have changed again. At the moment in the US, it might be 2 minutes or so before something new comes along, because the speed of change has been so fast in the last couple of months. But overall, I think the patterns that you've talked about are recognizable, and this is where I see the importance of them and where they're going. So you say that government is influencing tech overall and influencing entrepreneurs. And broadly speaking, of course, that's quite correct, because while markets have been reformed in the last 40, 45 years in China in all sorts of ways that I think this audience will know quite a lot about, it's certainly the case that this hasn't been accompanied by a liberalization of politics or the establishment of a sustainable ecology that looks like civil society or the public sphere in the broad sense. That said, I want to push back a little bit against the idea that this is government influencing private sectors as if there was a sort of arrow pointing from one to the other, because actually, I think the dynamic is more complex. And that, to an extent which isn't often obvious on the surface, there's actually a great deal of pressure that's brought back by the private sector onto the government as well. Let me give an example of what I'm talking about, because I think it relates to this question of where technology and the private sector go. Everyone here, I think, has heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, that's now well-known phenomenon. In fact, you'll begin to see the term itself is beginning, it's still there, but it's beginning to fade out a little bit, because GDI, the Global Development Initiative, is now the overarching framework, along with the Global Security Initiative and Global Civilizational Initiative, that are supposed to provide a sort of 3-part framing for overall governmental strategy, both at home and abroad. But as part of that name change, we have also seen a certain amount of shift in terms of what the overall broad goals of that BRI, or now GDI, want to do. And there's a move that has shifted away from what we perhaps saw in the 2010s, these large, famously opaque loans, to Sri Lankan ports and East African railways and so forth, many of which didn't work out very well as projects. And instead of much greater concentration in areas that China, with some justification, at the highest level thinks are going to be important areas to be embedded in, to dominate, and to create a path dependency for the 2030s and beyond. 5G and what comes after that, one very good example. Life sciences, perhaps less appreciated, but actually a really lively and flourishing area in terms of Chinese scientific research, and amongst other things in terms of global commons, that is actually in part planning for the next pandemic. We've all forgotten about the last one. Hope we don't have to think about the next one for a while, but certainly plenty of people in China think it might be coming, and there's plenty of life sciences research looking into where that might come from. One more example, perhaps one of the most significant in terms of technological development, is energy transition and green energy in particular. What do these three sectors have in common? They're all very heavily driven by private sector investment in China and by innovation within those particular sectors, as well as public-private partnerships. So life sciences, of course, have developed very strongly because of the very rich ecology of startups. But those startups probably almost certainly wouldn't exist in quite the way that they do were it not for the very significant governmental investment at university and research lab level in terms of some of the basic science. I think a lot of people would say that right now, the balance between pure science and applied science research in China pushes too much towards the applied side. But there's no doubt that nonetheless, the overall ecology that's emerged is very, very rich in many, many ways. So at one glance, that looks like the state saying, here are the areas of interest that we have, and here is creation of an ecology and funding that enables the private sector to operate that way. And there's something to that. But the flip side, and the part that's not so obvious, I think, is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think the realization has emerged that a lot of things the private sector is finding very difficult to deal with. I mean, use John's example there of, if you were operating in a state of ignorance and wanted anything as an AI entrepreneur, it will be absolute lack of regulation and smashing of the competition. Now, these are things that actually are being pushed very strongly within the Chinese corporate sector to the government, first of all, in terms of renegotiating much of the regulation that was put forward 3 or 4 years ago. And part of that was driven in part by an antipathy by the party towards certain entrepreneurs who were felt to be becoming sort of celebrities in their own right. Jack Ma being the obvious example, but there are others there as well. A realization that actually, particularly post-COVID and with a sluggish economic recovery, this was unlikely to be economically productive, has led to a pullback. But it's also led, I think, to more lobbying. And here I think you can look also at things like provincial and local government. Again, as with anywhere else in the world, but certainly in a very large country like China, looking at what regulations happen in Beijing is all very well, but looking at the way in which actually provincial and local level markets and ecologies develop is more interesting. Just a final thought on this, because I want to get on to discuss Paul and that discussion. Look at the way for thinking about tech in which different sorts of environments have emerged around Hangzhou, which is the home of Alibaba, southern China, the Bay Area, which of course borders with Hong Kong, Haidian around northwest Beijing, where Tsinghua and Beida, the MIT and Harvard, that way, of China are placed. Each of those places has nexuses of private entrepreneurs, all of whom lobby local government very, very extensively about regulation, about subsidies, about attracting talent, all sorts of things that create the ecology for that particular market. And those are not things that can be done unless there are bureaucrats and officials listening quite carefully to private sector entrepreneurs. They may not necessarily be sitting in the Politburo, but they are sitting in provincial, urban, and local government in some very influential places. And that is where I would look for the private-public nexus to be at its most flexible, rather than necessarily regulations coming out of the ministry in Beijing.
So thanks a lot. It was very interesting because you gave certainly more nuanced view about what's going on in China. So Paul, let's talk about Europe, where unfortunately we don't have, at least continental Europe, we don't have a very well developed tech sector. So dynamics are different. Europe was caught by surprise by the decision of the Biden administration to adopt the Inflation Reduction Act. It was caught by surprise by the US disengagement with NATO, and this implication from an industrial point of view. It's now caught by surprise by the trade war with Washington. So what sort of systemic response can we expect from Europe that tries to balance better the role of the state and the market in this context?
Well, thanks, Edo, and thank you very much for including me. Let me start by saying that I think that multinational corporations and my experience of multinational corporations are now out of their depth. That they have all, the people that lead multinational corporations have been formed in an environment lasting 25, 30 years or longer, in which they have been absolutely key players. And if you like, the coercive edge of the state has been held in a locker to the point of being forgotten. And I think they're now discovering with some discomfort that actually the state does have a monopoly over coercion, and it can use it and in disruptive ways. I think the tech people are different in some respects, partly because they value stability less and disruption more. And in that connection, I think that they don't have a very well-developed view of connections between economic disruption and political disruption. And I would say that some kind of political stability is probably a precondition for economic disruption, not dislocating societies. I also think that to the extent that the tech industry is concentrated in the ways that have been described, to the extent that they have any political sophistication, it's a sophistication that is operative here in the United States and less so elsewhere. So bridging to Europe, by which I mean the EU, for what it's worth, I think that by far the most sophisticated central bureaucracy anywhere on the planet is in Brussels, and strikingly small as well, with great continuity over the years. They, to the extent that they were taken by surprise in the shift to, if you like, industrial policy under Biden, I'm not sure surprise is the right word. The EU has had very tight policies from the beginning, so in the 1950s, 60s, about intra-state sponsored competition within the EU. So for those of you that are American, this is like kind of interstate commerce stuff a century ago here. I think that's now obviously under pressure, partly because of what Biden did, but in any case, because Europe, and I mean the whole of Europe, has suffered to even a greater extent than the rest of the West, worse than North America, in terms of weak underlying growth. But the real jolt given to that now is that over recent years and over recent months, Europe is facing the discomfort of having outsourced its defense for the past 70 or 80 years, which has been an incredibly comfortable equilibrium for the transatlantic alliance. And my best guess is that Europe now is trying to balance a very complicated set of objectives. One would be that they can defend themselves again without alienating America so much in the meantime that they are vulnerable to Russia in the short to medium term. But to the extent that they move slowly towards defending themselves again, this is going to fit with a shift towards industrial policy and a shift towards increasingly making defense kit in Europe rather than the United States. And you can see various things around Lockheed over the past few weeks. So there's that as an objective, and that pushes in the direction of some kind of industrial policy and many other things as well. They will also want to somehow maintain an alliance with the United States in slow motion. And therefore, they will want to calibrate their response in ways that maximize the chances of internal repair inside the United States without damaging their other objectives. You may have to listen to that sentence carefully, and I'm not going to repeat it, but there's something quite harsh said there. And this is where the kind of sophistication of particularly the trade part of the Commission, I think, will come in. I think they will target any response with American domestic politics in mind. And they've got a track record of doing that in on previous occasions. Coming back to multinationals, though, I think that multinationals, not tech people, multinationals will, particularly in the European states with a higher manufacturing presence, will push for closer trade relations with China. Because to the extent that there is a negative shock to the European economy from trades, Trump measures, and notice I'm not taking a normative view of those measures, I'm just taking them as a factor in the world, that will tend to push multinational leaders in the direction of making trade with the other great economic bloc, the three great economic blocs, the United States, the EU, and China, and then Japan. And it will push multinationals to push the Commission and Paris and Berlin to relaxing and expanding trade with China. And I think that will bring to, not necessarily to a head, but it will bring a tension with other objectives, which is Europe shares the United States objective of not wanting to be overly dependent on China in case the world takes a sour turn geopolitically over the next 20, 25 years. But if there's one group of people on the planet that actually I think are capable of discussing all of that in a coherent meeting, I think that they are in Brussels and the two main European capitals. Whether they can get that through the Council of Ministers, but they suffer a weaker version of legislative neurosis that is a constant here and which is the root of so many of America's problems.
So thanks, Paul. I would like to go for another quick round of questions. I ask the panelists to be well behaved and as concise as possible. So I would like to stick to this concept of industrial policies because, John, here at the center, especially last year, we did a lot of work about this topic, and it seems that industrial policies were sort of the only game in town. So they were rehabilitated and somewhat also abused, also here in the US. How do you expect the attitudes of the Trump administration to evolve towards industrial policy and also more specifically towards national champions? Because I know this is a topic that you have been thinking about recently.
So if you start with the notion, I mean, first of all, you just heard kind of a US perspective from me, you heard a Chinese perspective from Rana and a European perspective from Paul, but it's hard not to think about these things in some integrated and collective way. And I'll give you a specific example. So if you take a multinational, Apple, right? Okay, Apple gets 20% of its revenue from China. Okay, so that's about, I think, $70–80 billion a year. If you look at what they get from Europe, it's another 27% comes from Europe. So it's pretty hard for Apple to think of themselves as purely a US company. If you look at where Apple assembles products, not necessarily manufactures all of them, but assembles them, something like 95% of them come through China, right? And so if I'm Apple, I'm playing a complicated, all of a sudden I'm interjected into a complicated geopolitical environment that I have to figure out kind of how to navigate. Now, somebody described to me, they said it's a bad analogy, but they used it. And they said the Cold War with Russia was an ideological one that manifested itself in certain economic systems. Their view was that the Cold War today between Russia and China and the US is a technological one, right? And so how do you think about building kind of, if you think about national champions, how do you think about building kind of national champions that are competitive in a global environment, because you have to be competitive in a global environment. And that is an argument that a lot of the large, for example, I just happen to deal with tech companies, so I apologize for focusing on tech, but if you think about a lot of tech companies, you'll hear them make the argument, we should get protection against antitrust enforcement because we need to be national champions for the United States operating in a global market. I think that's fundamentally flawed. I think that's just fundamentally wrong. And the reason I say that is that, and just my background's a little different. I'm not a traditional academic. I worked at AT&T. I was president of AT&T's international operations. And I saw how large companies become, the term somebody used with me that I like is institutional sclerosis, right? You get a hardening of the arteries, their capacity to innovate, their capacity to change, particularly when you have technological inflection points like we're having now, is very difficult. And if you don't confront the companies with competition, then they don't innovate. They, as I said earlier, they try to freeze the ecosystem and protect their status. And so they don't really become effective global competitors, even though they will use that to protect. But every company in the world, you start off small, right? But you don't want to be small, you want to be big, right? And so you want to grow. And then once you're big, you want to maintain that size. And so you want to protect and stop. And if you can get away with, you know, exclusionary conduct and not get it antitrust enforcement to get you, so much the better. But you don't want them, when you're on the top, you don't want the world to necessarily change. So my belief is that industrial policy for the US should really focus on how do you create competition in markets. Now, it's hard for me not to think about how I would juxtapose that against, say, China. And I'm curious to hear kind of Rana's perspective on this, but you know, people think of China as not a competitive market, and I think that's flawed. And I'll tell you why. Because China is very good at creating barriers for foreign competition, right? And they're very good at providing capital at a low cost of capital. But the competition is cutthroat. My understanding is the central government allocates money out to provinces and regions, but then those regions kind of facilitate a process of building out companies, and those companies are incredibly competitive. And I'll give you the example somebody gave to me, which was in 2019, there were 500 EV manufacturing companies in China. Okay, by 2023, the competitive process inside of China had reduced it to 100. I don't know what the number is today, but it's much less than 100. And so if you can survive that kind of internal cutthroat competition, you are actually probably a very good company competing in global markets. And if you look at BYD, which is one of the leading EV companies in China today, it just surpassed Tesla as producing the most EV vehicles in the world by volume, right? So my take is on industrial policy for the US would be, one, firms have to operate in a global environment. They have to be able to sell globally. They need to be competitive in those environments. That doesn't mean you protect them at home by creating and allowing them to violate certain antitrust barriers, but you try to figure out how to create competition in ways that drive a dynamic, the Schumpeterian, you know, creative destruction process, that you drive the economy in that direction. That's the way we've lived. I'll do my 2 cents on the my frustration with the attacks on universities right at the moment. What you're doing is you are destroying the seed capital that is the core of innovation, and ultimately what VCs need to be able to invest in and commercialize. And well, Robert Solow, in 1957, Robert Solow wrote this path-breaking paper that got him a Nobel Prize. And he basically showed that the vast bulk of growth is attributable. What in his econometric work was an error term, but it was basically technological innovation is what drives growth, right? And so anything that starts to diminish that, or an industrial policy that in some ways starts to diminish that, I think is problematic. I'll leave it at that for now, and we can come back if needed.
Thanks. Now you provided me also a good bridge for the question I wanted to ask to Rana, that is precisely about innovation, the tech ecosystem in China. A few days ago, OpenAI asked for DeepSeek to be banned from the US because they claim it is a state-controlled firms. And it is interesting, going back to what also John was saying, that basically no major technological breakthrough in the US would have probably existed without support from the government, at least at the very early stages of development. So how does China's state support to tech companies, it goes back to what John already mentioned, differ from the US? And is there anything that we can learn from the China approach, given the recent progress, especially in AI and other technological fields?
There are some things that I think the wider world can certainly learn, and some things which I suspect are not easily applicable. So let's go with a couple of the first ones first. It depends, exactly how you count it, but I'd say that over the last 10, 15 years, maybe even longer, you have a year-on-year very significant investment across the private and public sectors of about 2.4% of GDP into R&D, broadly defined. As I've said, that can cover a multitude of different things, and maybe the investment in applied research rather than pure is too far in one direction. But the idea that essentially if you do planning that enables you to accumulate not just the physical plant, but also the human capacity over years and decades, that you'll benefit from that, is not particularly counterintuitive or particularly surprising in one sense. It does show, however, that you have to have some system of sustainable capacity to be able to make that kind of investment. Now, this is not, and I hasten to add, this is really important to say, an argument for authoritarian rule. In fact, it could be very much the opposite, because if, as has happened in many societies over the last 70 or 80 years, you get democracies that have some points of consensual agreement about what is good for society as a whole, and that happens in areas, or has for a long time in areas like pensions, for instance, where people have to think ahead for quite a long period of time, then it's perfectly possible to do that in democratic societies too. And in fact, it's notable that until recently, even now, actually, if you look at the list of top 5, 10 most innovative nations, China, of course, is up there, probably at number 2, but you also have traditional democracies, the United States, the UK, in fact, and indeed Japan and South Korea. So there are plenty of countries that maintain strong and vibrant democracies, some more vibrant than others, but nonetheless manage to maintain a long-term commitment to R&D. So China does do that, but I don't think it does it in a way that suggests that the rest of the world couldn't do it as well. Interesting counterexample to that, where it's not, I think, going brilliantly well at the moment, maybe people in the audience will have something to say about this, is India. Because India is, invests a lot in some very high quality technological R&D and institutes such as the famous IIT suite of colleges that work in this area. But in terms of distribution of capital, in terms of infrastructure, in terms actually of the way in which STEM graduates can be distributed usefully in the economy, India still operates at a lower level than China. And actually that also has partly to do, there's a feedback loop effect, because per capita GDP in China is about $10,000 per year. US, in practice, in rich areas, it's more like 23, 25,000. India's per capita GDP is more like 3.5 to 4,000. In other words, it's a poorer country, and unless it finds ways to innovate to become richer, GDP isn't going to rise to the sort of level that will sustain that kind of middle class ecology. Let me flip from that to saying something about why China's system permits a certain type of innovation that will be hard in most broadly liberal societies, although I'm going to say that advisedly with an asterisk for a reason I'll say in a moment. There's no division, or no meaningful division, between civil and military and state and private usage when it comes to innovation. Of course, the private sector is separate from the state sector in business, in as much as private sector companies have shareholder value that they have to look after, they have stock market valuations, all that sort of thing. But in terms of the ability of the state as a whole to penetrate what they do, competition is absolutely fierce, as John says, when it comes to commercial innovation, and certainly antitrust law and laws that prevent intellectual property being stolen between private sector actors are becoming much stronger in China. That's a very different thing from the idea that overall the state has access and capacity to access any of those types of innovation for things that it wants to do. And in many cases, including in areas that don't seem immediately defense-oriented, such as life sciences, there is the capacity to be able to use innovation in the military sector to spread out to the commercial sector. Various types of AI would be a good example of that, and vice versa. I don't know that anywhere else, I don't think there is anywhere else with the scale and size of market or population that China has, that has that level of fungibility between state and private and the military and civilian. But I will say, and again, this is the same thing as Paul was saying. I say it in a normative way rather than a judgmental way, 'cause it's not for me to judge. The point about the way in which private sector and public sector and those involved with them are interacting in the United States at the moment shows, I think, a very fluid moment in the interaction between democracy, capitalism, and the role of business in general. Elon Musk is the sort of headline name everyone comes up with, but as I think John was saying in his comments, there's a lot more complex interaction going on in which the use of technology in particular is going in directions that traditional Cold War era capitalism, I think, wouldn't have contemplated in quite that way. And while China might not be an example of what happened, or rather an exemplar to follow, it is an example of the way in which, when those things interact in ways we haven't previously seen, they produce different sorts of results, many of which, as China's economy shows, can be highly productive and innovative, but may produce a very different sort of society from what either we've experienced before, or indeed, in the case of China, a different society from what China was just 20 or 25 years previously.
So thanks, and I would like to close with Paul. Your latest book is Global Discord. Do you see the possibility to get to a global accord in terms of a sort of global governance that can try to make this different system work together again, because there is a clear divergence in what's going on in the different areas?
Not anytime soon, but eventually. Two things. First of all, let me just say that I think Rana mentioning India is tremendously important. I was an official until 2013, and in the early 2000s, I was wandering around London and elsewhere saying we're not talking about China enough in a perfectly neutral way. People talk, the word exponential is widely used, but people don't seem to understand that compound growth is really quite powerful. We should be talking about India lots now, because if they achieve sustained growth, then they will be very big. And this will bridge to what to your question. The other thing I want to say by prefacing my remark is that John mentioned Schumpeterian dislocations, and Rana also dwelt on technological change. These are moments of history where states, and before states, political systems come under great pressure. You can think about the French Revolution like that. You can think about the American Civil War like that. You can think about the First World War like that. Very few political systems have actually proved resilient in the face of massive technical change. It so happens, in a sense, it would be better if I weren't British in saying this. My country's political system is one of the few that did. And it did so in the late 19th century, 20th century by extending the franchise and introducing a welfare state. I think it's a really important question whether the United States political system and also the People's Republic's political system can withstand the dislocation that's coming, and will go on for a while, because what these dislocations do is they move around who's rich and who's not. So the composition of the rich changes. It's not just that it changes who's poor and who's in the middle. It changes the composition of the rich, and therefore the pressure points on politics from different parts of the rich. That is one reason why this will take a long while. Another reason it will take a long while is because to find a new global system is, I think, that the system of international regimes, trade, monetary, on and on and on, all operate under the umbrella of whatever sustains world order, by which I mean peaceful existence amongst the most powerful states. And that was true in the 19th century, when world peace was kept in often ugly ways by a balance of power among the great European powers. It's been true since the middle of the 20th century under American hegemony. One way of thinking about the Cold War is that the Soviet Union walked its way out of the highways and byways of international commerce. There is a contest going on between China and the United States and its European friends. That will take decades to sort out. I think it may easily take a century to sort out, or to settle down. During that period, I think there's a good chance India will rise. And there's no regime building. And I have chaired G20 committees. There's no regime building when the thing that you need to take for granted, which is the terms of peaceful coexistence among the great powers, is in question. So a building that I kind of worked in a lot, the Basel Tower, which is a center of power for international finance. Imagine having conversations there in the G20 about cyber stuff. I mean, you're not going to have any real conversations about that because cyber is an instrument of the contest. So I don't think so. Barring, the exception is barring a decisive conflict of some kind, which is decisively won. Not necessarily physically won, but decisively won. There is a clear winner, and they can set the terms of the game going forward. And I think that a lot of debates, I think that, let me add one thing, Ada, if I may. I think much of the debate about domestic policy here, and to some extent in China, but especially here, still hasn't inhaled that. Still doesn't think, actually, to what extent are these things that we want to do, are they actually going to help China in the thing that we think is our greatest priority, which is the contest with China? And I'm not so greatly surprised by that, because the point about prolonged peace is you get silos. This university is fantastically siloed. Actually, this school is quite siloed. Much more importantly, most governments are highly siloed. Monetary stuff, trade stuff, security stuff. It wasn't like that in the middle of the 20th century, because it couldn't be like that then. I have argued in my book that it shouldn't be like that now, but you don't change things by writing a book. And even books that sell hugely more, they don't change anything, really. People have to bump into problems and think, oh, damn, we really should have spoken to those other people who we don't even know where their building is. And that's a problem in Washington and in London and in Berlin, perhaps least of all in Paris in the West.
So thanks a lot. We are a bit late. We have roughly 10 minutes for Q&A. So feel free. Okay, you?
Thanks so much. My name is Olga. I came from the business school, so a little less siloing. I have a question about the US dollar. So this is the first time in history we have a global hegemon that's basically deficit-led as opposed to surplus-led. If you think about the British Empire or any other empires that came before, is de-dollarization a risk, and how would you see it play out?
This is clearly a question for Paul, but any other wants to ask a question, because maybe it's easier in the interest of time if we collect a few. Okay, maybe.
Thanks. It seems to me that all three regions need growth to some extent over the next decade, right? China needs it more than ever. Europe needs it more than ever. And the US, I would argue, needs it, has had it rather, but it's concentrated the returns to capital rather than median workers, which is why, in part at least, Biden lost the election. So if all of these three countries need growth, but all of the moves that they are making are, at least in the short term, are counter to growth, i.e. raising trade barriers, directing investment away from maybe productive sectors of the economy towards defense, which may or may not be productive, increasing barriers to immigration, is there not a trade-off between the kind of short-term politics and the long-term economics of all of this?
Thanks. And
thank you very much for your remarks. I'm curious how moderate politics and moderate parties adapt to AI and the new tools that we've seen today. I mean, a great trend we've seen is very much the emergence of TikTok as a way to communicate and also to say a lot of rubbish in politics. And I wonder if moderate parties and in their next electoral campaigns, how, or if you were running for office, how you would tackle the use of these new tools to communicate effectively and bring a positive vision.
Thanks. So maybe we can start with Rana, because he has to catch a flight soon, and then we move.
Right. Thanks very much indeed, Edo. I think I'll probably just come in on that question of long and short term perspectives, because that's probably the one where I can add the most on the China context. I think there's a very interesting and weird anomaly happening at the moment, which is that we all know, and it's come, conventional wisdom, over time, China's demographics will be shifting fairly definitively, and it will become a much older society, a society that needs more pensions, needs to deal with the costs of old age, which include, pharmaceuticals, all these sorts of areas, elder care, all the things that we know that aging societies like Japan, South Korea, and indeed the United Kingdom have started to deal with in recent years. We also know that these things are tremendously expensive. So one of the questions is whether or not China's economy can provide the kind of growth that will enable that sort of provision to be available at a kind of, global middle class level for such a large proportion of its people. One of the obstacles in the way is the anomaly, which is that in the very short term, as of course is also, I think, now well known, China's economy is misfiring in various ways that, in my opinion, all other thoughts and more expert ones, is not, fatal. There's no cliff edge that's going to be fallen over. But it makes it very difficult to essentially stimulate the kind of growth that's going to underpin the costs of those longer term problems. Right now, youth unemployment is very significant in most of China's cities. Official figures, before they stopped being officially promulgated, ran at 25% or more in some major cities. Many people will say that at least in some cities, actually, the real number is closer to 30 or 40% in some cases. We know that, for instance, the development of human capital is extremely uneven across China. Yes, school children doing STEM in schools in Shanghai and Beijing in middle-class areas do extraordinarily well, certainly better than either British or American school kids when it comes to maths in particular. But when you look at the countryside, we are still looking at areas where educational provision and capacity to increase life chances is still spectacularly bad, in large part because, again, the hukou system, the internal permit system for residents, does not permit full moves from countryside areas to city ones without losing. It's not illegal, as I'm sure people know, but it means that your welfare and other rights don't transport with you, and nor do your children's rights. So that mechanism, which forces many people to stay in rural areas which do not have the kind of educational and developmental capacity that's needed to get to a richer society overall, are going to be a continuing drag, not a fatal one, as I say, but nonetheless a real one in terms of creating regional disparities. We all know from many countries around the world, the United States as one, that regional disparities are not everything in terms of overall GDP or in terms of overall tech development or international significance, but they are very significant if you live in those very significant, very substantial parts of one of those countries where life chances are extremely restricted. Ask many of the people who voted for a very alternative form of government in the last US presidential election. China's people clearly don't get to vote, but there are all sorts of things, including frequent local level protests that usually manifest themselves against local governments rather than central government. I would certainly expect to see that ways in which China's very real capacity to reform in terms of innovation, technology, and so forth can actually create real jobs and new forms of employment to be the major challenge that Taiwan faces in the next few years. And if anyone's listening, I would suggest that's a much better and more appropriate use of time, effort, and money than trying to get Taiwan back. I think the first is a rather more long-term and prosperity-driving sort of enterprise.
Thanks a lot, Rana. In this probably these countries are adopting masochistic policy when it comes to growth, precisely because of what Paul was saying. Even the hegemon has lost trust in the system that it has created, and there is no global will to reform it. So probably that's one problem. But we are quite late, so I ask maybe Paul to tackle the first question. And thanks, Rana, to tackle the de-dollarization or whatever you want.
Let me just say one thing in response to Adrian's question. I think retail politicians, people voting to be in power, or competing to be in power, make a great mistake if they don't tune into how people spend their lives. So I think one of Trump's great strengths is that he kind of follows and is part of the wrestling world. here, which is actually, I'm completely serious. I can't imagine how it could be sensible to be on the other side of politics here and kind of not know about that. People criticize him a lot, not just on policies, for being repetitive. Well, pop songs, the lyrics in pop songs are endlessly repetitive, and they always have been since the middle of the 20th century. And yet pop music is one of the kind of most extraordinarily successful things commercially and in terms of the kind of culture of the last nearly century now. And I think what that boils down to is kind of really being interested in the people that whose votes you're competing for, not just caring about them in some kind of platonic way, but being interested in them and being interested in being among them. On the dollar, I think it's probably a mistake for any state. My country did this at a point, but in rather different circumstances, to say, you better use the dollar or else, or you better use our currency or else. And that Britain did do that with its empire. And I'm certainly not defending its empire, but it actually had an empire when it did that. So it was capable of enforcing its will, and did. It also had lots of voluntary support in the Second World War from people around the world, its empire, in a kind of semi-voluntary way. And this goes to the point about growth, which is, I think what we're seeing, one of the things I say in my book is 3 maxims for government. I can't remember what 2 of them are, but the third is, don't make unforced mistakes. And I think we're seeing unforced mistakes as the pressure of a new international economy kind of feeds into domestic politics. And people think, how do I get through the next year and get elected again, or the midterms, or rather than thinking what might be in the longer term interest. Of the 3 areas you identified, China, the United States, and Europe, it is an extraordinary thing that only one has easy wins, and that's the EU. So the EU has obstacles that, if it could push the obstacles away, capital markets union, single market union, in levels term, not in underlying growth, then there will be a shift upwards. I mean, China doesn't have easy wins in that sense. China is still on catch-up, Balassi Samuelson, but it doesn't have things where it could just wave away things, and nor does this country. The EU does, and it will be very interesting to see if in this we may need to defend ourselves moment, they think actually we ought to overcome the political obstacles to what are, I assert with confidence, are easy wins in terms of kind of short to medium term growth, not to long term growth.
John, the last words to you.
I'll touch on each quickly, even though I don't claim expertise on all of them. On the kind of question of the dollar, it's interesting. If you look at the country in the world where there's the most foreign direct investment, it's the United States. It's over $5 trillion a year. Now, one of the big giant risks right now is that with some of the actions that have been taken in the last few days and whatever, the U.S. as an attractive investment place diminishes. And then that damages significantly the value of the dollar. There was something strange this morning where normally the kinds of tariff announcements that Trump made yesterday, the dollar value should go up, but the dollar value went down. And so there is a risk of, America, the U.S. has always had this exceptionalism because of the dollar, and the dollar as a global currency, if you will. But this could be kind of severely damaging to your point. I'm going to hold off for a second, and I want to, at the end, I don't know if he wants to say, Ted Truman is here, and Ted is like one of the world's experts on some of these issues. So I feel embarrassed to kind of say too much with him standing there. On the growth piece, my take is that a lot of the issues in the United States right now are problems of growth. But what do I mean by that? You had raised the question of the distribution of wealth, basically. And if you look at growth, economists tend to look at it in aggregate. So how much did GDP growth? They spend a little less time, most economists, thinking about the distribution of that wealth. But I think some of the problems that we've had, probably what's allowed a certain degree of the rise of President Trump is that for the first time in the history of the United States, people are worried that their children are not going to be better off than they are. In fact, they're pretty sure they're not going to be better off than they are. So, people like myself, it's like you start worrying about how does that play out? First time ever, right? And that creates a lot of dislocation. And I think the issues are kind of socioeconomic. And so while growth is critical to addressing that, I think the distributional questions are paramount. And it's partially the actual distribution, it's partially the distribution of opportunity, a sense of the equity and the fairness of the opportunity. But look, this isn't my area of expertise, so that's just me speaking. Any of you could probably provide your perspective on that just as well. On the parties piece of it, the last thing I'll say there, the political parties and how you approach it, there's a professor here, some of you may know, Todd Rogers, right? And Todd did some research which helped him get tenure. And he started off trying to figure out how to influence voters to vote, right? And one of the things they did was he ran a very systematic randomized control trial kind of experiment. And he took one group and just called and said, are you going to vote? And then he took a second group and he called and said, are you going to vote? And then they asked questions about, do you know how you're going to go to the polling place, how you're going to get there? And so that just the act of laying out a plan was part of the conversation. And then the third group, he said, the first two things, are you going to vote? Do you have a plan? And oh, by the way, we're going to follow up with a few people to see if you were actually able to follow your plan. Okay. If you look at each, and you can get the voter turnout, so you can see who actually voted. You can look after the fact. And he mapped it. And that process of the specific conversation led to much higher turnout. Those people that said they were going to turn out actually turned out. Right? Now, why am I telling you that story? Because if you think of AI, the capacity to know enough about people in great detail that you can create a story for them as to how they can turn out to vote and also predict the likelihood if they're going to vote for your party will start growing up dramatically. Now, if you carry that to an extreme, it's kind of scary, right? Because it feels like an incredibly manipulated political process. I don't know how that will play out over time, but I think the capacity to collect data, use AI algorithms to predict behavior, use AI algorithms to predict what you can say to people to increase the likelihood they vote, all of those things are going to go up significantly in my view, but I don't know how to deal with that. I have no clue how to deal with it. You don't need to say anything, Ted, okay, never mind.
So thanks a lot, John. I want to thank also Paul and Rana and you all for staying with us until a bit longer than we expected. So I wish you all a nice rest of the day. Bye.